All right, everyone. Jeremy Knopf here with another episode of the Public Relations Declassified Livestream. And we got a couple of great topics we're going to be covering here today, as well as a guest that some of you guys have seen before. So we're going to go ahead and jump right into it. First thing we're going to talk about is how long your pitch should be. So this is a case where size does matter, despite what some of you guys may have heard in the past. One of the mistakes that I see a lot of people make when it comes to pitching is they will just make this big, gigantic, outrageous pitch. It's just got every piece of information you could possibly imagine, and it just goes on and on and on. And that's a huge mistake. So, when we talk about how long should a pitch be, it kind of goes back to the old sales question, right? Where people say, well, how much should this cost? Well, how long should a piece of rope be? It should be as long as it needs to be. But in the case of a pitch, you're reaching out to a journalist with a particular story. You're pitching them on why their audience would be interested in that story. Generally speaking, less is more. So the point of a pitch is not to tell the whole story, not to give them every piece of information they're going to need for the story. The point of a pitch is to get the journalist interested enough that they're going to want to reach out, get additional information from you, and then turn that into a story. And if you can't get them interested in a short period of time, if you can't grab their interest right away and get them engaged, more information is not going to change that. So it doesn't come down to, well, if I just give them all this extra information, then they're going to be interested and then they're going to want to do my story. That's not the way it works. So you want to keep it nice and tight, make it very impactful. And in last week's segment, we did a great segment on how to craft a pitch, how to make it engaging so that journalists would actually want to feature you, to tell your story. In fact, Chrissy, why don't you go ahead? I know we've got the link to that in the outline document. Why don't you drop that into the chat on Facebook for everybody who's watching? If you guys want to go check out last week's episode, that was in one of the segments where we talked about how to actually make the pitch engaging. All right. So when we're talking about how long it should be, I generally like to have a pitch be about 300 words or less. Much more than that, and you're really creating this kind of mountain of information that most journalists are just going to skip, right? They're going to see this wall of text, they're going to ignore it, they're going to move on to the next one. So the key is getting them interested. And what I like to do with that is make it easy to read. So if we start off by keeping it nice and short, 300 words or less is a pretty good rule of thumb. Then from there, you make it easy to read. So I like to break it into short chunks. We've got our first sentence, which is going to be very short, very impactful. It's going to lead with emotion in some way. You might be leaning on a statistic. You might be sharing a piece of news that other people don't have yet. You might be leaning on some emotional story, whatever it may be. But you want that first paragraph, which is just one sentence, to be incredibly impactful and really engage people's emotions. Then you want to have an impact statement. And generally 3 to 5 sentences is plenty for this, right? What impact will this have on somebody? Then we roll into the qualifications. And this is not your life history. It's not every qualification you've ever earned. It's not every degree, every certification, every designation. It's just, why are you the person qualified to opine on this? And then a call to action. If you follow that framework, which we covered in depth in last week's episode, and keep it nice and concise, you're going to have the type of pitch that's going to be both engaging, but also short enough that it doesn't overwhelm a journalist. Because what happens is if they see a giant email and it's just got tons and tons of information, rather than taking the time to scan through it, most of the time what they're going to do is they're just going to shit can it and they're going to move on to the next email. So we want to keep it nice and tight so that they're going to see it. They're not going to be overwhelmed and they're going to be more likely to read it. Now, obviously, we still have to engage with them emotionally so that they see this and it's interesting to them, and then they want to reach out to you. The other things that I like to do with this is I like to leverage bullet points. So if you've got, let's say you've got a couple of key points, you're talking about maybe some new law that passed in your industry, or there's some new security vulnerability in a software application that a lot of their audience may use. You throw a few bullet points in there, it makes it really easy for them to digest that information without having to look at it in, kind of like long form content. They're not having to read this as a paragraph. They're just reading bullet points. Makes it a lot easier for them to scan it, get the pertinent information without having to go and read this mountain of text. Okay. And then the other thing I like to do is use bullet points or italics on certain keywords that might be particularly relevant. So if there's a topic that's trending, italicize that or bold it. And then if they're scanning this and it's already short, so if they're scanning it, these bold and italic words are going to stand out a lot more. So now you're not only making it shorter so that they're more likely to read it, but you're also segmenting the information in a way that they can quickly scan, see exactly what they're looking for. And if it's relevant to them, great, they're going to find it. If it's not relevant to them, it's not going to really matter, right? They're not going to be interested if it's not relevant to them. But by making it short and then breaking it up like we just talked about with bullet points, short statements, bold and italics, that makes them a lot more likely to actually read it. And if they read it and it's relevant, then they're far more likely to have an interest in it and reach out to you to potentially feature you in that story or do a story about you, however it ends up being structured. So this is key because I see so many people get it wrong where they'll come in and they'll think, well, if I just give them all of this information, they're going to find something valuable there. And that's just not the way it works. When they get too much information, they start to tune out. And then you could have killer information in there, but if there's so much there that they don't get to it, then it's not going to have any impact. So this is why it's so important to keep it nice and short so they can get in there, find what they need quickly and easily. And then if it's a fit, they're more likely to reach out to you. All right. So we're going to go ahead and jump into the next segment here. We're going to talk about a PR crisis that some of you guys may have heard about. If you're not in the tech space, maybe not. It's kind of I guess I would classify this as a bit of an esoteric topic. But Cloudflare had a little PR crisis over the weekend. I think it actually started Friday. But unlike most of the other PR crises I've covered over the last year or so, this one has been done really well. They managed it very effectively. And this is something I don't see a lot. I see most companies handle it poorly. And in the end, that hurts them in a pretty big way. So a little bit of background. Cloudflare, if you're not familiar with it, is a service for the technology industry. Basically, it is a DNS service, which is kind of how the backbone of the internet works, right? It tells your computer where to find a certain thing. If you go and search for something, or you go put in a web address, or you send an API call to a particular tool, rather than the IP address, right? The 192.168.whatever, rather than going to an IP address, which is where it actually lives, the DNS service resolves that search or that domain name or that API call or whatever, resolves that to the IP. So basically, think of it like the old school phone directories, right? It just basically tells your computer where to find what you're looking for without you having to be a computer expert. So this affects how everything on the internet works. And so they had a major outage, and it affected millions of websites, platforms, and other services that went down because of this. Now, they didn't initially know what it was, but Cloudflare jumped into action immediately when this happened. And at the same time, so obviously they've got all their tech people, they mobilized to identify and solve the issue. And as soon as they had enough information as to what was going on, their CTO, the Chief Technology Officer, took immediate accountability. Now, it's worth noting that the situation was rumored to have been caused by an outage from Google Cloud, which apparently one or more of Cloudflare's services relied on. But the CTO of Cloudflare never put the blame on Google, never tried to, take any accountability off of himself. He just took complete ownership and issued a statement on X. Let me see if I can read this from here. It's a little small on my screen at the moment, but it says, we let down our customers at Cloudflare today. Our workers' KV service failed, and the downstream products that rely on that service had outages of their own. We will publish a full postmortem soon. I know that these kind of incidents have real and serious impact for the teams around the world as they do their work and serve their own customers. Beyond the specifics of this incident, the postmortem will go into detail about how we are removing this failure case. We will do everything we can to make this right going forward, and I apologize for the problems caused today. Now, this was, frankly, a textbook case of handling a PR crisis perfectly. So, like I said, when it happened, they immediately started looking into why it happened and taking steps to resolve it. But at the same time, the CTO took accountability. He made an apology. He didn't blame anybody else. He didn't say, well, it went down because we used this Google service and it went down. At the end of the day, that doesn't matter. All that matters to your customers, to your clients, is you fucked up and it impacted them. So the other thing that he did, in addition to taking accountability and apologizing, is they talked about what they're doing to prevent this in the future. And this is such a critical factor because when you screw up, and we're all going to screw up at some point. We all make mistakes. We're all human. When you screw up, people will generally understand that. And they're generally not going to hold it against you, assuming that it's not some absolutely ridiculous, like a blatant negligence or stupidity or something like that. If you screw up in a reasonable way, and then you do take accountability, you do apologize, as long as you follow through with that by putting systems and processes in place to prevent it from happening again, people will generally be pretty forgiving. And he did a great job of that. And this is really critical because in the technology world, people rely on their tech, right? Let's say Google goes down, for example, Google G Suite, right? That's what we rely on for our email and our cloud storage and a whole bunch of other things. If that goes down, that means my whole damn business shuts down. If I can't email journalists, if I can't give them the files and the documents and the quotes that they need and all of the stuff that they need for the publicity that we're earning for our clients, then our business grinds to a halt. So people rely on technology to a very high degree. And what happens is, honestly, I think a lot of us have an unfair expectation when it comes to uptime. Like, we expect technology to just always work, and that's not realistic. But when it comes to technology, people depend on it in a way that they don't depend on a lot of other things. Like if let's say you run a trucking company, you expect your vehicles to break down. If you're a construction company, you expect your workers to be sick from time to time. So, or you expect your tools to break. When it comes to technology, we generally don't see that same level of grace. We don't see people expecting that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up Vic here. So Victor Font, Chrissy, if you can go ahead and pull on his camera. So Victor Font is a good friend of mine. We've done a lot together over the years, and he is in addition to being a killer developer, he's also a cybersecurity expert. So I wanted to bring Vic on for a little bit today to talk from the perspective of an IT guy, right? A cybersecurity expert, and kind of get some thoughts on, from an industry perspective. You're far more tapped into that world than I am. And I wanted to get your take on kind of how you feel as a user, as a customer of Cloudflare, and kind of what you're hearing from other people in the IT industry, in the cybersecurity industry, from how this whole thing played out.
Well, actually, when knowing that I was coming on, I started taking notes because part of my background is in business continuity and disaster recovery. I've built BCDR systems for very large organizations. And while Cloudflare passed the PR test with, I wouldn't exactly call it a flawless response, now comes the architecture exam, because this is where I think that they failed. Business continuity and disaster recovery needs to be defined early in the process when you're picking vendors. And, they did especially well. They communicated early and consistently once they had reliable information. What about that first hour, the first 30 to 60 minutes, when customers were starting to think it was their own systems going down? There was nothing coming out of Cloudflare.
Hmm.
I wasn't one of the people that experienced an outage that day because I used their core services, and their core services never went down. And I would stop short of calling their response flawless, because some might argue that true full accountability would have included a stronger acknowledgement that they designed key services to rely on a single third-party identity and access management vendor. That's the infrastructure that went down. And
Yeah.
it created conditions for a failure cascade. In complex cloud ecosystems, the choice of architecture is as important as incident response. While they responded well, communications viewpoint, they committed to a post-mortem and future improvements, but they haven't yet laid out a detailed plan of architectural changes that would prevent third-party failures. And this happened 6 days ago. Now, if I was
Okay.
still working,
So that's a fair point, but I would push back a little bit. So, and you said that you don't think they had a flawless approach from a PR perspective. I would disagree with that. But from a cybersecurity perspective, from an IT perspective, do you think? Okay, so I guess twofold. One, yes, building on a single point of failure that relies on a third party is definitely problematic. But you said 30 to 60 minutes, they didn't have a response out in that time frame. Do you think it's reasonable for them not to have known, A, that the problem was going on, or B, the severity of the problem at that particular time frame?
I think they should have realized what the problem was. Uh,
Hmm.
you know, they're positioning themselves as a zero trust leader. Zero trust is the future for identity and access management. And seeing parts of their zero trust stack go down statically during a cloud outage, this creates lingering doubts as to their multi-provider resilience.
That's a fair point.
And they protected their brand, they reassured customers, they demonstrated leadership by taking some accountability under pressure. But the real test that they have to face now is how they turn this incident into an opportunity to strengthen their operational resilience for the long. It was certainly a strong communications performance. There's no doubt about that. Better than many tech companies.
Yeah.
But really is tested not just in messaging, but in whether you design your systems to survive the next outage without customer impact.
Now, you talked about the post-mortem. Let me interrupt you for a second. 6 days, roughly. What is the typical time frame to go through and evaluate a situation like this and develop an accurate post-mortem report?
In the companies I worked for, we would have a post-mortem the very next day as soon as the problem was solved, find out what happened, and we would write it up, and we would have it out within 3 to 5 days.
Okay.
And if we didn't do that, we failed in our jobs. And I just see that, they need to step up in that area. And truthfully, I think they should have had this handled way before, because that's what business continuity is. You anticipate potential outages and you do what you can to mitigate them. Now, for a company that earns I guess fiscal year last year, they had 1.67 billion in revenue. They can afford infrastructure redundancy.
Yes, I would agree. Do you think it's reasonable to assume that they've done the post-mortem internally and they're fine-tuning how they're getting ready to report that publicly, or do you think that's not the case?
I would only hope so at this point, because I don't have a view into internal Cloudflare processes. But
Yeah.
I would hope to have something out to the public relatively soon.
Okay. So as a user, as a technology expert, so two different buckets to look at here. How do you feel as a user in the technology field about their public response? And then how do you feel about, obviously you've got your thoughts on this should have never happened. There should have never been this level of dependency on a third party. And I guess part of this section of the answer will also depend on what they end up putting in place to prevent it. But what's your thoughts on those two aspects there?
I think it's pretty much. All right. So let me. All right. Just run that question past me.
All right, I'll break it in. I'll break it separately. We'll take, so first of all, as a technology expert, as a user of their platforms, how do you feel about how they've handled the messaging on this?
Well,
announcing it, apologizing, etc.
I think they did the right thing. I think it was a little bit late coming. They could have sent out some pre-messages. Hey, look,
Sure.
we've identified. We're looking into this. We don't verify, and we'll get to an answer. But they found the root cause, and they realized it wasn't within their data set, that it was Google. I think they did a job stepping up and saying, hey, look, yeah, this is what happened. But again, they're still pointing to external. They're not saying what we're going to do to fix this to go forward.
Yeah.
So I have to regain the public trust again, because right now, especially, you get people paying for the zero trust platform.
Yeah.
And it's big dollar stuff. They don't even publish how much they pay for Google. Google and Cloudflare never revealed how much their infrastructure is costing. But
okay,
it's something that I would need before I get into zero trust architecture through Cloudflare. I would need to regain in that area.
So, yeah, I think, from my perspective, purely from a PR perspective, I think they handled the messaging fairly solid. I think that, if you're saying that you feel that they should have had the information sooner, as far as what was going on, how it was happening, or even the fact that it was happening, right? You said it was like a 30 to 60-minute delay. I'll give you that. But everything from that point, I feel they've handled masterfully. But then, like I've always said, once you fuck up, not only do you have to apologize, take accountability, but now you have to lay out your action plan to prevent it and then actually implement it. And so now that's the phase that they are at, where they have to implement that in order to regain the trust. I don't think they've necessarily lost trust. I think people are just skeptical. They're concerned, and understandably so. But now it's incumbent on them to execute on that, whatever that plan is, which they've not yet announced. But if they successfully execute on that plan, I think their brand is going to come out stronger than it was before. Assuming that they put out a good plan, people agree with it, and they think it's they think it's an effective approach.
I agree with you 100% on that. And I think that they have the ability right now, they can turn this into a community and basically dominate the zero trust platform if they do this right.
Absolutely. So, for everybody else who's watching, what I would recommend doing if you ever find yourself in a PR crisis, unlike most of the other PR crises I've covered, follow Cloudflare's advice, or not their advice, their approach, right? Do what they did. Take accountability early, apologize early, map out your plan to prevent this stuff from happening in the future quickly. Now, like I said, and Vic was talking about as well, they still need to implement that, and then we need to see what the results of that are. But they're on the right track. They've done a lot of things great, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. I'll be keeping my eye on it. Vic, if you hear of anything, you've got your fingers on the pulse of this a little bit more than I do, I think. So if you hear something, let me know, and we'll definitely do an update on this at some point once we have some new information on it.
Well, you're one of the few people.
What's that?
Get it? I said you're one of the few people on speed dial, so you get the info first.
Sounds good, brother. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right. Awesome. All right. So we're going to go ahead and roll into our next segment, guys. And this is going to be 5 things that should never be in your pitch. So, I've talked this week about the length of your pitch. Last week, we talked about some of the things that should be in the pitch and how you should structure your pitch. But now I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you should completely omit from your pitches. Now, what we have to remember here is every single pitch is a first impression. So think about it like this. That journalist is sitting there, they open up their inbox, and they see your email. If you don't have a relationship with that journalist where you're regularly communicating, and I don't just mean sending them an email, if this isn't someone that you can send a text to or pick up the phone and call, or you go out to lunch with, basically every pitch is a new first impression. So if you're sending them a pitch and you're doing shit that they don't like, and there's certain things, journalists are very particular about a lot of things. And if they keep seeing things that they don't like, you're creating a bad first impression each time. And I say first impression, even though you may be pitching them every month or even every week, who knows? It just depends on what your situation is. For the most part, it's still a first impression because they get so many pitches. They're seeing so many messages that they probably don't have any clue who you are. They don't remember your name. They don't recognize you because they've just got this deluge of messages. So I like to look at this as every pitch being a first impression. So the thing is, if you get something wrong in that pitch, you could have an otherwise great pitch, right? It could have exactly the information they want. It could be structured exactly the way they need. It could be a topic that everyone's talking about, and it would be a perfect thing for them to cover. But if you get something wrong in that, and it's the type of thing that they specifically don't want to see, that can derail that otherwise amazing pitch. So we want to avoid that. So here are the things that we're going to skip. We're never going to put these things in our pitches. The first, and frankly, this should be a no-brainer: spelling and grammar mistakes. All right. We're all going to make mistakes. I know that I type really fast and I make mistakes all the time, and I'm probably one of the worst spellers that you'll ever meet. So I always make sure to double check everything before I send it. And your email platform is already going to highlight anything that's incorrect, right? Your spelling errors are going to be underlined in that little squiggly red line. You're going to have, if you've got a tool like Grammarly, it might tell you where, certain things are worded poorly, or not just poorly, but incorrectly. Maybe you've got a correctly spelled word, but it's the wrong word, right? Or the wrong usage of the phrasing, things like that. we want to make sure that our messaging is dialed in there. And that's honestly one of the easiest parts to get right, because you have the spell check and you've got grammar check tools and you've got all this stuff that it will automatically tell you if something's wrong. But beyond that, put an extra set of eyes on it. Does it really say what you want it to say? You know, you want to make sure you're not twisting up your phrasing or things like that. Another thing that we want to avoid is that dreaded wall of text. So this is something that I see. We talked about this in the first segment today. You know, people are so worried about trying to get their message across that they just put every piece of information into the pitch that they can think of. And it's basically verbal diarrhea. And it's this massive wall of text. And what happens is the journalist is going to see that. And it's just going to be, it's one of those, you know, TLDR. I'm not going to read all that shit. Nobody's got time for that. So they just delete the email, right? They ignore it. So we want to avoid that wall of text and use the approach I talked about in the first segment, where you're breaking it up. You know, you've got short paragraphs, you've got bullet points, you've got bold and italic, and you're just chunking it up in a way that they can quickly scan it, rather than a wall of text that will turn the journalist off. All right, so another one is anything generated by AI. Journalists hate this. It's something that they complain about a lot in the private industry groups, right? There's these private groups where journalists communicate. The public never sees it. You don't have access to it. It's not a public group where you can even see the posts. It's a members only community. And there's multiple groups like this. And this is something that journalists complain about all the time. These people who are using AI to write their pitches or even to write their own quotes. And they hate it. And most of the time, 99% of the time, they can tell when something is written by AI. There's patterns. And these are people who deal with words all day, every day. So they can notice things that you probably won't, because you're not somebody who deals with words in the same way that they do. So you want to avoid using AI, whether it's for the pitch itself or for writing your quotes. It makes you look silly. It makes you look unserious. And frankly, it makes you look incompetent, because if you're really the expert, if you really know what you're talking about, you shouldn't need to rely on AI to pitch the journalist or to craft your quotes, you know, your responses to their questions. So we want to avoid anything with AI. Another thing we want to avoid, and this may sound counterintuitive, is images. So journalists generally don't want to see images unless they specifically ask for them. They don't, for the most part, they don't need them anyway. They're generally not going to show up in an article unless it's an article that is specifically about you. And we've talked about that a bunch. You know, most articles are not going to be about you. They're going to be about a topic that you happen to be opining on. So there's no need for images. It doesn't bring any value to the pitch, doesn't bring any value to the conversation at that particular stage. If they do want images, they will ask you for them. And at that point, then of course you can send them to them. But they don't belong in the pitch. They don't bring any value. All they do is hurt things, right? They will clog up the email. There's nothing that positive that comes out of it. And then the other thing, and this is kind of related to images, is attachments. So, you know, nobody's going to read your case study. Nobody's going to read your annual report. Nobody's going to read your, your excerpt from your book unless they specifically ask for it. When you put attachments on an email in a pitch, the other side of it, aside from it being a bunch of stuff that they don't care about and they're not going to read anyway, is a lot of these larger companies, you know, the big national outlets, even the local outlets, frankly, they have pretty strict filters on their emails. And a lot of times, a lot of large companies will have filters that will actually block emails from external sources that have attachments on them. So there's a good chance that if you send a cold pitch to a journalist and you have attachments on it, it doesn't even show up in their inbox. It just goes off into a spam folder, or it gets quarantined, or it just doesn't even show up anywhere that they have access to it. And I see that happen a lot. People will put on, their press kit, right? Beautifully designed, presents you as an absolute rock star. It's got you standing on stage maybe, and it's got a whole bunch of links to previous media features and your bio and your headshot and all this, sexy stuff here. But you attach that to your email and send it to them. There's a good chance that these email filters completely block that email entirely. And if it doesn't block the email, it will at least block the attachment in many cases. So I generally won't send attachments in pitches. If they reach out and ask for it, I'll typically provide it as a link to a Google folder or a Dropbox folder or something like that, depending on what your workflow is. But that's generally a better way to do it. But they don't belong in the pitch. That's something that comes later down the road in the follow-up information. All right. So that's 5 things that you guys absolutely should not include in your pitches. Doesn't bring any value. All that it does is bring down the impact of your pitch and decrease the likelihood that you do end up getting featured. So keep it nice and clean, short, to the point, with no extra shit, and you're far more likely to get featured. All right, we're going to wrap up today with Jeremy's PR PSA, and that is that everyone will face a PR crisis at some point, and how you handle it will make or break your brand. You only get one shot to get it right. So, we talked about Cloudflare. They did a great job so far. We'll see what happens over the next week or so, see how it plays out. If they actually release their plan and then execute it, if they do that, they're going to be in a strong position. So far, they've done everything right. A lot of the other PR crises I've covered, that has not been the case. These various brands, whether it be individuals like the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni thing that I've talked about, or Bud Light, or Liberty Safe. I've talked about a lot of these different PR crises. Most of these companies have gotten it wrong from the start. And once you do that, there's no going back. You can't fix it after the fact. Bud Light, they had their PR crisis. God, this was probably at least 2 or 3 years ago. And they're still on their knees. They are not, they're not recovering at all. Their sales are still down. The public hates the brand. And, they went from being the #1 beer brand to they're not even in the top 10, I think, the last time I looked. So once you get it wrong, you can't fix that. And when I say you can't fix that, I mean in the reasonable short term, right? So we're talking, years. So that's why it's so critical to get it right in the beginning, and then you don't have these problems to deal with. So hope you guys found this useful. If you did, I would love it if you would share this with somebody, share it on social media, whatever. And if you're not in our Facebook group, be sure to hit that QR code. Public Relations Declassified is our free Facebook group where not only do we stream Public Relations Declassified into, but we also share additional information, additional resources. Plus, it's a lot of awesome people that you can connect with and find synergy and potentially do business with in there as well. So that's a wrap for today, guys. And I'll see you on the next episode. Thanks, everyone.